Thank you very much. My name is Joe Gary, and welcome to Broadway Buzz. Once is an extraordinary show. It's an amazing, intimate theater piece that really, in some ways, defies description. It's taking the Broadway musical down to its minimalist form, but it deals with a story that is slight, it is gossamer, it is fragile. Once in a lifetime, you may meet someone that for some reason changes your life. And whether that person becomes a muse, gives you confidence, gives you a vision of self, gives you a way of proceeding the rest of your life, this person then impacts us in a very powerful way. All of us have had this experience. And this is what Once gives us. As you know, it started out as a small independent film that became greatly loved literally everywhere in the world. For a moment, let me just go back and sort of set the framework for you about the story of Once. Okay, it began as an independent movie. It was shot for a minimum amount of money. They had $150,000. It came in under budget. Ultimately, the show made $20 million. It was a story that had a very slight script, a young boy playing his guitar on Grafton Street in Dublin, a sort of lost young boy whose only sense of self came through his music. There is a chance encounter where he meets a young immigrant girl on the street. They form a kind of relationship that lasts a very short time. But in that week, this young girl acts as a muse to him, and he's able to write extraordinary music. I mean, it is a kind of love story, but it's a story about art also. It's about the story of creation of pieces of art, of sensitive little songs that will really describe the young man's condition and will elevate him to a different position. Now, the two young people who starred in the film were the composers of the film. Glenn Hansard is an Irish lad who was in his early 30s. Let me just give you a little bio about him. He came from a very poor Irish family. This is a period, of course, where Ireland was suffering tremendous deprivation. His father was a serious alcoholic. And his father, in his youth, was a very aspiring boxing artist. And he had this tremendous skill. He knocked everyone out he went into the ring with, and they thought that he had the potential of an international career as a boxer. But somewhere after he had won 17 rounds, the end result was that he sort of lost his need to fight, and he lost his muse, and he was no longer able to fight. He became a hopeless alcoholic and spent the whole rest of his life never really discussing why he gave up the one thing that might have taken him out of that sort of Irish ghetto and given him a life and given his family a life. And so his young son, Glenn, who is now an aspiring musician, always had that same fear that someday the muse would leave him and he would not be able to write songs. So the shadow of his father has always been on the young man's life. Well, the young man will go on to have a phenomenal success, and this is the story I want to tell. So Glenn Hansard, at age 13, went home and announced to his family that he was going to give up school, that his real aim was to be a composer, and the only way he knew how to do that, since he couldn't afford music lessons and he didn't have any entree into the professional world of music, decided that he would stand on a street corner, play his guitar, and sing. And that's exactly what he did. He became what we call a busker. And a busker, of course, is a street entertainer who has his hat on the ground, and as people walk by, they throw money in the hat or in the case for the guitar. And he sings the songs that he's been so busily composing. He started that at 13, and he never stopped. And he worked on the streets of Dublin performing. Keep in mind, there is a long history, especially in the British Isles, of street performers. If you have the opportunity of going to England and you go to Covent Garden, of course you see the most sophisticated street performers in the world. And they're acrobats and jugglers and cyclists and mime artists and singers, opera singers, contemporary singers, and they perform on the street in the square at Covent Garden for money. And so in this long tradition that really goes back to ancient times, the French had troubadours outside of Shakespeare's theaters. There were buskers who were performing for money. And so in this long tradition of being a street performer, this is how Glenn Hansard developed his career as a musician. He had an extraordinary voice. He could jump octaves when he sang. He used his voice like it was an instrument. So sometimes he doesn't even sing words, he sings sounds. And yet he's able to create this very hypnotic environment in his music. So Glenn Hansard, this young man coming from a very poor Irish family, started a group in Ireland called the Frames. And in this group then, he started to distinguish himself, and his music started to be heard all through Ireland. And he represented sort of the plight of young people in Ireland. And he spoke to everyone, young and old, about the need to connect, the need for love, the need to experience life in a dimensional way. Okay, so this is really the young hero that you're going to see as a character in the musical tonight, called Guy. But this is really based on this young man's life. At one point, his mother believed so strongly in him, I mean, they really had no money and they could barely get enough food, that she went to a bank and was able to talk a banker. You know, the Irish all have the gift of gab, and she had the ability to talk the banker into loaning her a very small amount of money so that her son could record his music. And that was the beginning of his career in the professional musical world. Okay, so now fast forward. In this group that he created called the Frames, he had a musician who loved music as well as cinema. And he was given a guitar, this man named John Kearney, and John Kearney was also given a camera by his father. And he was as interested in the camera as he was in his guitar. So he decided that he was going to write a movie about a street busker really based on this Glenn's life, and he would call it Once. So he wrote a very brief sort of outline. He submitted it to the Irish Film Bureau, and the Irish Film Bureau kept turning it down, one, because he had no credits, and two, because the story seemed very slender and wasn't really clearly articulated. It was going to be a movie done almost totally through music. And so the end result was it looked like the movie would never be made. But John Kearney, who believed so deeply in the genius of the leader of the Frames, Glenn, that he continued working on this project. And something very interesting happened. The man who was in charge of the Film Bureau went on leave for 6 months. And in that time, there were just a few office assistants there. So every day, John Kearney would go to the office saying, "Have you approved my grant yet?" And finally, they got so tired of having him come to the office that they said, "Yes, we will give you what in substance was 150,000 US dollars. They did it in pounds, but it equaled about 150,000 US dollars. And they said, "Yes, you can go ahead and make this movie." So John Kearney didn't get any of the things you need. I mean, if you're filming on a street, for example, in a city, you have to get permission and you have to get the rights to do it. And so he didn't do any of those things. So he decided that he couldn't really afford real actors for this story. So he went to Glenn Hansard and he said, "I really want to sort of do a story about your life, about you playing on the streets, and about you going through that sort of breakup you had with your girlfriend. And I want this to be a very intimate story about what life is like in Dublin for young people at this particular time. And most of all, I want this to be a story about creation, about what it is you do to create music." And he said, "You know, I want to have a young girl in this story who will sort of be your muse, and I want her to be an immigrant, because keep in mind at this point, Dublin had large numbers of foreigners living there, and they would survive by selling flowers on the street. I mean, life was very difficult." So the end result was, Glenn Hansard said, "I actually know a perfect girl. She's from the Czech Republic. I've known her since she was 13 years old. She's a pianist. We've actually written some music together, and I think perhaps we could work well together in this film. So by this point, the young girl was 17 years old. So they got together, and in a very brief period of time, they wrote this incredible score for the movie. And so the major premise of the movie is a young man who's fallen out of love. His girlfriend has moved away. He's left with nothing. He's challenging his life, his career, whether he will ever have a career as a musician. And suddenly then this young girl is able to sort of act as a muse, and she inspires him to write music. And in fact, as they were making the movie, they made the movie in 17 days on the street. They used long lenses so they didn't interrupt any of the action of the life of Grafton Street in Dublin, a very busy street. And when they needed to do interior shots, they went to Glenn's family house. They went to pubs that they knew. And so it was really done absolutely on the cheap. When the movie was completed, it was clear that there was something very magical about this movie. It was a very delicate, very tiny little story about hope, about creation, about love. And at the end of the period, the young man and the young woman go off in their separate ways. But nonetheless, they had touched one another in a way that would define literally the rest of their lives. So when the movie was released, first of all, it was released at the Sundance Film Festival, and all of the international critics went wild. They found it an incomparable, delicate, fragile, beautiful music. Many of them called it the most perfect movie musical because the music is a major way of telling the story. You have to listen very carefully to the lyrics of these songs because they really give you insight into the development of the young people, their relationships, their love, their sense of music. All of this is recorded in these really beautiful songs. So the end result is that the movie became a cause célèbre, and it played literally everywhere in the world. And suddenly these two young unknown people, keep in mind, Glenn Hansard basically supported himself by singing on a street corner. And suddenly he was becoming an international celebrity in the film. Ironically, the song that was one of the songs in the film called Falling Slowly won the Academy Award that year in 2007. And if you happen to watch that award ceremonies, what was so phenomenally incredible was seeing this sort of bewildered young Irish boy who was sort of scruffy, just being tongue-tied by this tremendous honor. And then this young Czech girl who spoke so simply. She wasn't in a designer dress and she wasn't featured on the red carpet, but she was the real thing. She was an authentic person, an artist with very deep feeling. So suddenly they became an enormous cause célèbre. And what they did was they put together a world tour that they called the Swell Season. And the two of them traveled together primarily through America, but then at other major cities all through the world. And they presented live the music that they had created in the movie Once. It's really a documentary I strongly recommend for you to look at, The Swell Season. It shows what success did to these young people. Ironically, in the story Once, they separate, but while they were on the tour, they became involved emotionally and had a long 2-year relationship in that period that they traveled with the Swell Season. And as the pressure kept building and building and building on these people to perform night after night after night, keep in mind, these were young people that were very sheltered from the brutal world of commercial theater and concerts. So the end result was it had a very heavy toll on their lives. And then, lo and behold, it was decided that a musical was going to be created based on Once. Okay, now let me talk about this for a moment. Keep in mind, what made the movie so powerful is that it was so intimate. It was so sort of improvised. The two stars of the movie, neither of them were actors, so you were seeing the real thing. You were seeing young people connect in this very dimensional way. And of course, film can do that. And it was filmed it was partly like a home movie and partly like a documentary, But what it was so guileless, it was so simple, it was so straightforward, it was so disarming that it touched everyone very deeply. And then when you heard those two people sing and the blend of the voices, and you'll hear that in the show, they've been enormously successful in reproducing this, both in New York, in London, and now on the road. And the young actors that they've hired have this capacity to have voices that blend so brilliantly. When Glenn Hansard wrote this music, he was very influenced by Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen. And so it has this sort of folk, pop, rock quality to it. But it's very, very soulful music that is very rangy music. And the young Czech girl, Markéta Irglova, had this very thin but beautiful voice, and she always sang in harmony to Glenn's singing. And so there is this brilliant melody line and then this enormously emotional harmony line that you keep hearing. It gives you goosebumps when you see it executed, and it happens all through the show tonight. There is some extraordinary musicality that goes on in the show. So, okay, the decision is made then to make a musical out of this. Now keep in mind, we go back, this is a very tiny, very intimate, very gossamer piece. It's very fragile. It was very particular to the composers who both acted in the film and then sang the roles in the movie. So this is a very hard act to follow. But they did an incredible job in the transformation. I mean, almost more than any time, I really long for you to go back and see that movie and see the tininess of it, the fragility of it, and then see the way it explodes on the stage. Okay, so happily, this project was put into absolutely brilliant hands. Let me introduce now a new name. His name is John Tiffany, and John Tiffany is an English director, and he achieved great success in theater when he created a work called Death Watch. Death Watch was a show about a Scottish group of military people sent to the Middle East during the atrocity that's been going on for the last endless number of years in the Middle East. And it was an account of what happened to these young boys in the Middle East. And it was done in such a powerful and visual way. John Tiffany is known not only for bringing something to life in a very visceral way so that the audience connects with it so deeply, but also he does it in a very provocative visual way where the story is told in such a powerful visual terms that the visuals are as important as the language. So John Tiffany turned out to be the perfect choice. You may also know his name right now. One of the great successes in New York right now is Glass Menagerie. And Glass Menagerie is being done, I mean, as you know, it was one of Tennessee Williams' greatest plays, probably his greatest play. And it's had brilliant productions, you know, over its long half-century history. But John Tiffany's version has generated more interest and more excitement than almost any version of the show. It will probably sweep the Tony Awards this year. But again, it's because he's able to bring to life visually that which is so inherent in the story. So picking John Tiffany was perfect for doing this work. They also, it was John Tiffany then who suggested that they hire a wonderful Irish playwright named Enda Walsh. And Enda Walsh has written 20 or 30 very sensitive poetic plays about being Irish, about life in Ireland, about life on the street in Ireland. So again, he was a kind of poet that would be perfect to translate the images of the movie into words and situations for the musical. And so they put together this very strong creative team. They spent over a year doing workshops and trying ideas to see how they would develop this and expand it into its musical form. I mean, keep in mind, very often when we translate movie musicals to the theater, we have to somehow make them smaller because sometimes the movie musicals are so big, so outrageous, so extravagant that they have to be revisualized. In this case, the reverse had to happen. You had to take that which was very tiny and find a way of expanding it so that it would accommodate a musical theater treatment and that also it could find its life in the musical theater. So they added one other very important person to this mix, and his name is Steve Hoggett. And Steve Hoggett is a choreographer who's never taken dance classes. Again, he's a very visual choreographer. He's really more of a movement coach. Some of you know a brilliant show that happened in New York called American Idiot. And it was a musical that was done very vertically, where the actors literally climbed the walls. This was all Steve Hoggett's brilliant contribution that he made to it. Right now, there's a wonderful show in New York that I've had my fingers crossed for 2 years that it would tour, and it doesn't seem to be. And it's called Peter and the Starcatcher, and it's sort of a prequel to Peter Pan. If you're in New York anytime between now and January when it closes, I really beg you to see it. It's an extraordinary work. But again, part of the reason it's a brilliant work is because Steve Hoggett has found this visual way of manifesting the sort of Peter Pan story in a way that's so provocative and so touching that it really pulls the audience in the show. Okay, so they put together this perfect team. They then started working on this show at American Repertory Theater, which is on the campus of Harvard. ART, American Repertory Theater, has always been part of the Harvard curriculum. It's the way people have studied theater at Harvard. And there's a long history of ART doing a lot of very experimental work. Right now, there's a brilliant woman running ART. Her name is Diane Paulus. And you know her work in that she recreated the production of Hair that started at ART, that ultimately has traveled all over the world. She reimagined Porgy and Bess, which is coming here. And also, she has just created Pippin, the new sensation, the reworking of the Stephen Schwartz musical that's had a tremendous success, winning the Tony Awards this year on Broadway. So Diane Paulus is sort of the goddess of the theater right now, and she has this place where people go to work on projects at American Repertory Theater in Cambridge. They also have a small second stage there called the Oberon, and it seats 80 people. And that's where Once was born. It was rehearsed in the basement of a church. They worked for 3 weeks. And I want to show you how some ironies enter into the creation of a new work. At the Oberon, at this little 80-seat theater, they were also playing a show that was called The Donkey Show. And The Donkey Show was a musical version of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And that version took place in a bar. And so while they were rehearsing Once, they realized that the bar added tremendous atmosphere to the work. And ultimately, the bar became the central image of the story of Once. So the way the musical is told now, it takes place in an Irish pub. You see a bar, center stage, and then you see a group of chairs lined up. And all of the musicians, singers, actors sit in those chairs, and when they're in scenes, they get out of the chairs and perform in the space in front of the bar. So the bar becomes a metaphor for the show. And it really happened by accident because they started rehearsing at American Repertory Theater, and it was the perfect way of making this show accessible to the audience. So when you go into the theater tonight, you're invited up on the stage to have beer or to have a drink. And you have to behave so you don't fall in the orchestra pit. But there you are, and the actors are all around you, are getting their instruments ready and rehearsing and singing a little bit. And so you're right in the atmosphere of the Irish bar. During the intermission, again, you have the opportunity of going up on the stage. And this is the kind of visceral thing that the director and the choreographer are noted for, their ability to connect the audience to the show. So this little fragile show that took place on the streets of Dublin now becomes very accessible to us because we're in this pub that many of us have stepped into as audience members before the show or during the intermission to have a drink and to take on the atmosphere of this story. One of the things I want you to watch very closely as you watch this show is the way the musical numbers are told. In the movie, basically, there were solos and there were duets, and then there were a few choral numbers. But in this version of it, they have 15 musicians on stage, and they all play all the wonderful Irish fiddles and ukuleles and banjos. And so the music takes on a texture that is so deeply Irish, and the mood is so firmly established, and the idiom is so strongly Irish that it takes you into that world in a very powerful way. When you listen to the music, be very sensitive to these harmonies that I talked to you about, to the idea that sometimes the human voice is just used for sound. The human voice is used sometimes as an instrument rather than as a means for saying lyrics. And yet it's an amazing form in which it pulls you into the show in this very provocative way. Keep in mind, one of the things that a director has to do that's so important very early on is he has to come up with a concept for the show, how he's going to make this show connect with the audience. What is the environment he's going to put the characters in so that they can interrelate in a very powerful way and yet have that interrelationship reach the audience in a powerful way. And this all has to do with atmosphere. So we pay very special attention to lighting in this show, to staging in this show. I mean, we're given this very direct device. I mean, at the beginning of the show, you have all of the actors sitting in a half circle looking at you. And you know, they're connecting with you as you are connecting with them. And then this very delicate and powerful story is told. So a few things I want you to realize how one musical influences another musical. This is a very unusual theater piece. I mean, it's so tiny, it's so microscopic. I told you it started in an 80-seat theater, and now it just played in Rhode Island in a 3,000-seat space, and the audience was as electrified in that 3,000-seat space as they were in that intimate little Oberon Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This all has to do, again, with the director's skill and the designer's skill to make that show accessible to you and to make it fill the space so that you can relate to it. So it's a show that you just sort of sit back. It's a deeply personal show because we've all had this experience of having someone transform our lives in a special way. And not only are we watching a person being transformed, but we're watching art being created, because literally in the telling of this story, you're watching these songs being developed into what will become major works. And keep in mind, Falling Slowly has become one of the great songs to win an Oscar. It's been done, Josh Groban has done a brilliant version of it, incidentally. And now this show has swept the Tony Awards, winning 8 Tony Awards and winning Best Musical. So music that appears to be absolutely unlike Broadway music suddenly takes a powerful form. It tells a story, it moves the story forward, it creates enormous amount of atmosphere, and the greatest part of all is that it connects you to the story in a very powerful way. So I think you're in for a very great treat tonight, and I hope you will enjoy once. Thank you very much.